No, I'm not talking about Africa, and I'm not really an expert on terrorism. In fact, my colleague Jonathan Barker, who's written a book on the subject, may be more of an expert than I am. I am a student of Muslim societies, a man with many Muslim friends, and some of this flows from my disturbance at the discourse, not only in most notably in the United States, but really all over the Western world about terror. And these reflections are the reflections of a scholar, to be sure, but somebody whose knowledge comes from reading the newspaper, from online, and reading a couple books, one of which was written by my colleague Barker. Now, since the failed, and so a lot of it is very contemporary stuff. Those I go back, as historians have a wont to do. Since the failed coup in Turkey, the Erdogan government has sought the extradition of Fethullah Gulen, charging him with being a terrorist. Now, the coup plotters seem to have been, though nobody has confirmed this, seem to have been Gulenists. But whatever Gulen's involvement, his ideology seems to be the antithesis of terrorism. The charge of terrorism seems to have become a way to influence public opinion, and often a way to get American support and possibly some European support. There are several aspects of the discourse on terrorism that I would like to challenge. The first is that any regime threatened by unrest or violent resistance accuses its enemies of terrorism. The other characteristic of this discourse on terrorism is that it's Muslim. And when a shooting incident takes place, or a bomb is set off, or a quote-unquote terrorist incident takes place, the press, the media waits to see if it's Muslim. And this is true as early as the Timothy McVeigh bombing in Oklahoma City. The immediate instinct was this was Muslim terror. In fact, it was a right-wing survivalist. A white guy from the heart of America, a veteran of the US Army. And I must confess at the time, because of the incidents, I was praying that it wasn't a Muslim who set off that bomb. Because I knew that if it was a Muslim, it would be a cause not only for Muslims being persecuted, because some of the people who operate on these simplistic ideas are very ignorant people. And so that many of the people who got attacked were people who wore turbans, who might be Sikhs, or in one case it was an Iranian shopkeeper, who was not Muslim. He was, I forget whether he was Baha'i or what he was. So it's important, and one of the things I will underline in the course of my talk, you'll have to shut me up when I hit an hour, because I may.
I'm not very good at that.
Is that terror is not and has not been limited to Muslims, nor has it been limited to the right or to the left. The third is the notion, which flows from this, that terror is an ism. That is, there are people who believe in terror. Now, there may be a few. Carlos, the jackal, the famous guy who went from movement to movement and seemed to get a certain pleasure from setting off bombs. Though he also got pleasure from seducing women and from living undercover in fancy hotels. So what pushed him? Who knows? But he's an unusual case. Because for most terrorists, terror is a tactic. If they are successful, if they're not killed, they often become ordinary citizens. The only country I know that has had 2 ex-terrorists as prime ministers is Israel. And though I didn't particularly like Menachem Begin, he was a guy with a political vision. In fact, he was contemptuous of Muslim terrorists. I once wonder if when he and Arafat got together, they would talk about how to make bombs. But in fact, he was very contemptuous of the PLO, even though the PLO, and I may add what he did, for those of you who don't know history, he was head of a group called the Irgun, and the Irgun blew up the King David Hotel. The King David Hotel was where British headquarters were, but it was also a hotel. And of the 81 people killed, the majority were either clerical staff or hotel employees. But this is a problem with terror, that you set off a bomb and the people you kill are people who happen to get in the way, and they're not always the people you want to kill. He did destroy British headquarters, and the Irgun continued to use terrorist tactics, even though, and so too did the Haganah in a way, though perhaps in a more disciplined way. During the war, they attacked, they massacred Arab villages or tried to drive Palestinians out of their homes, which I would see as a terrorist. In any case, there's also the notion, which is true in public discourse, then it goes back to People's Will, which I will talk about, a Russian populist organization. There's a sense that the terrorists are some kind of unique person, that they're a particularly depraved type of human being. And probably the most radical thing I'm going to say is a lot of terrorists are very decent but terribly misguided people. I'm not approving, and I will not defend terror, but when Ulrike Meinhof, one of the leaders of the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany, which I will mention later, when she committed suicide, they dissected her brain in order to do research on whether there was something in the brain matter that distinguished terrorists. Some of this is absurd. I think people do not engage in terror because they believe in terror. Terror is a tactic used by diverse groups, often groups that are desperate. It's often used by people who don't see a chance to achieve their goals by other means. And I'll mention several, because some of them are very effective. And in some cases, it gets involved, terror is part of utopian hopes that a small group of people can somehow affect radical change. The final thing, I've already said this out of order, is that the established order sees them as uncivilized. And the discourse goes on and on. People like Bush and Blair, for example, told us regularly that terrorists hated our freedom and our democracy. I think most of them, and they're talking about Muslim terrorists, their assumption is that terror is a Muslim thing. And in fact, some terrorists have been convinced that democracy is imperfect. Many of the terrorists of the 70s and 80s were very utopian, very idealistic. And some of them had great trouble coping with failure and with the real world. They're often utopian. Some of them are rather gentle and charitable when not involved in their terrorist enterprise. The other thing that terrorists are often accused of is cowardice, which I find rather bizarre, because the one thing that marks terrorists is their willingness to risk their life for the causes they believe in. somehow cowardice is bad. And it always startled me as somebody who, I think I'm a coward. I duck when people are shooting at each other. And I certainly don't go out of my way to take risks. If that's being a coward, so be it. These people are not cowards. They're risking their life, and in fact, in the case of suicide bombers, they're consciously choosing death for a cause. Now, the question is, what is terror? The first use of the word, well, I'll get to this a little later. The dictionary.com talks about the use of violence and threats to intimidate or coerce, particularly for political purposes. The Oxford Dictionary goes a little further. It defines it as the unlawful. So if it's lawful, if the state is doing it, it's not terror, presumably. The unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in pursuit of political aims. The most consistent aim, if you study terrorism, is the desire to produce change or to stop change by sowing fear. That is, the organizations that use terror want people to be afraid of terror. And in a way, the discourse on terror reflects the fact that it's the established order. Who do the terrorists try to kill? They might set off a bomb in a market that you and I are patronizing, but when they get into assassination, the people they've killed are people like Tsar Alexander II, Aldo Moro, Admiral Blanco in Spain. And they kill cops. And obviously these people are afraid. The police agencies have often ended up being able to cope with them. Now, the first use of the term was for the French Reign of Terror, which is interesting because the Reign of Terror was the use of the guillotine to eliminate opponents of the government. That it was a use by the state, which was under the control of the Jacobins in the 1790s, the use of the guillotine to eliminate and terrorize their opponents. And there are other examples of the use of state power to create terror. Certainly the Nazis, the Soviets, regimes like the Cambodian regime of Pol Pot used purges, concentration camps, mass executions in order to intimidate and terrorize the mass of population. The other use of state power to terror, though this is not part of the popular discourse, is air power. Air power, it has generally been proven that air power is usually dysfunctional. I say usually because what's happening in Aleppo now suggests that really if you drop enough bombs on a place, you can just flatten much of it. But over the years, I mean, the Allied strategy in the Second World War was, particularly British strategy, was to bomb the bejabbers out of Germany in the notion that this would break the German will. Earlier in the war, the Germans had the same attitude toward Britain, though in the Battle of Britain they had much less firepower than the RAF and the American Air Force had in 1944. Some of the atrocities committed in this air war are massive. Hundreds of thousands of people died in Dresden, which those of you who know about Dresden probably know about it through Kurt Vonnegut's novel. There was also a massive bombing, I think, of Hamburg. And these bombings killed hundreds of thousands of people, and yet they didn't break the will. In England, certainly, there was a sense of, if anything, of strengthening. And the thing that's amazing about Germany is that the determination of many Germans to continue fighting lasted till the end of the war, when it was a lost cause, when the German General Staff knew it was a lost cause. And yet German soldiers continued to fight. German factory workers continued to make bombs. So terror, probably the most systematic use of terror by air power, has not been terribly effective, though it does provide us a living for a certain number of people, a large number of people actually. Modern terror begins with the invention of TNT by Alfred Nobel, something which may have inspired him to create the Nobel Peace Prize, because I think he always felt a certain amount of guilt that he was interested in TNT for use in mining, which obviously explosives are very valuable. But very quickly they were useful in war, and they were useful to terrorists. Now, since then, diverse terrorists have been quite imaginative in the ways they have developed to kill people. High-powered rifles, pistols, airplanes, and various ways of delivering bombs, IEDs, car bombs, suicide bombers. A Japanese group even released poison gas on a Japanese subway. Terror tactics have been used by so many different groups that I could spend the whole hour just listing and giving a sentence or two to each one of them. They are overwhelming, and those of us who've lived through the second half of the 20th century are familiar with all of this. Anybody who went to the theater in London in the 1980s went through metal detectors because of the fear of IRA bombs. And this is true in many different areas. The modern history of terror, the first group that ideologically committed to using terror was the People's Will, a Russian group which hived off the social revolutionaries. Social revolutionaries were a populist group of agrarian reformers. They were generally from the middle and upper classes. And they really believed that they were dissatisfied with the freeing of the serfs. They wanted to go further. And in 1874, probably their first massive action was to send people out to the countryside to organize the peasants. And lo and behold, the peasants didn't want them. The peasants were scared. It's not that the peasants might not have believed some of their ideas if they were expressed in different ways, but peasants were scared. And peasants turned them in, and many of them were arrested. Some of them went to jail. Some of them were mistreated. And this stunned. I mean, the people who went out to the countryside expected to be welcomed in open arms. And a small group hived off and turned to assassination. Now, while most of their targets were chosen from the more reactionary figures of the Tsarist regime, their greatest success was the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, the Tsar who had freed the serfs. Now, of course, they didn't see that as anywhere near adequate. They probably saw it as an event that is a cosmetic invention, because the peasants were still poor. But as often happens with terror, the effect was a period of reaction and repression. The reign of Alexander III was very right-wing, was a regime in which the Russian state developed its police powers, and some of the terrorists some of them were executed, many of them went to Siberia. Some of them are very interesting people. They were educated people. Some of them have come over, particularly those who like Vera Figner, who, if you see them later in life, they were attractive, generous people who spent time in charitable activities. The second group in the late 19th century that turned to the use of terror, though in a somewhat more unfocused way, were anarchists. And because the anarchists were all over, there was a massive fear of anarchists. I mean, if a piece of a set in a Paris play fell over, people would start screaming that a bomb had been set off. There was just this massive, and the anarchists some of them did bombing, indiscriminate bombing, and others did assassination. But the consciousness, whether it's Haymarket in Chicago, it goes on. The number of people who were killed, the most publicized case in North America was the Sacco and Vanzetti case, where the evidence accusing these two Italian anarchists was, there was no evidence. Or there was, and in any case, it was, but by the early years of the 20th century, the tactics and techniques of terror were beginning to become generalized. Safe houses, the complicated chronology. I mean, you would try to, if you wanted to kill the people who wanted to kill the Tsar, had to figure out when he would be out of his palace, you know, when he went to the summer palace, or when whatever his hobbies were. And it took a long time. A lot of people worked hard in trying to find a moment when they could throw a bomb under his carriage, which is what they did. But I want to give you a sort of rough typology of the kind of movements that use terror. And then I want to make some comments about terror. A lot of the most successful groups have been nationalist, but often they're successful in disparate ways. Probably the terrorist who had the greatest effect in world history is a man named Gavrilo Princip. Gavrilo Princip was involved with a small group of Serbian nationalists. And in fact, I think he was the only one in the group who was over 20 years old, and he wasn't much over. And you know, this was a group of outsiders who were fascinated at terror, and they wanted to strike at the Austrian state. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was coming to visit Sarajevo. And they worked hard, and it was a lucky break for them and an unlucky break for the people of Europe, because this was probably the bloodiest war in human history. In some ways bloodier than the First World War because of the tactics used, and because medicine was not up to the standards that penicillin and the modern drugs saved a lot of lives in the Second World War. But the irony was that they knew that there was a possibility. They knew that there were groups that were hostile, and so they changed their route. And Princip just happened to be on the route they chose. And when the carriage came, he acted, and he killed Franz Ferdinand. And Franz Ferdinand wasn't even, you know, was a person of no, I hate to say, but many nobles are of limited consequence. even if they had killed the emperor. But he wasn't the emperor. He was, and he wasn't a particularly reactionary figure. But he was a symbol of the Habsburg state, and that's what they wanted to do. But since then, there have been dozens, if not hundreds, of groups that have used terror. And some of them have used terror for, because of their own weakness. Mau Mau, for example. Mau Mau didn't have guns. They had a handful of guns. And when one of the Mau Mau narratives describes a unit going into an operation with 32 bullets. Can you imagine that? A mafia assassination, they shoot more than 32 bullets. They had a group of, I don't know how many, 5, 6 people. Each one got 3 bullets. And one result of this is they didn't kill many Europeans. They killed 32 Europeans during the whole Mau Mau struggle. They did sprout a tremendous literature, which doesn't mean it's a good literature. The best known is Robert Ruark, who wrote a bad novel called Something of Value, which was transformed into a movie which exaggerated the stereotypes. And it also involved British experiments, or Western experiments, which groups have been trying to do ever since, to deal with counter-terror, to deal with what was called brainwashing when the North Koreans did it in this Korean War. And the Mau Mau was broken in a brutal and very systematic way, and yet the literature is one that treats the leaders of the Land and Freedom Army, which is what they called themselves. Nobody knows where the term Mau Mau comes from. Treated them as a bunch of subhuman beasts. I may add those who survived, those who were not killed, emerge into an independent Kenya. General China was a rather opportunistic leader who was not interested, he was very hostile to the government, but he was not interested in throwing bombs at anybody or going back into the forest. He was interested in getting a good job, which is often true of terrorists as they grow up. But there are other nationalist groups, the Basques, very effective. And yet even with the Basques, there's stories with the Basques. The Basques are quite ruthless, and yet there are some fascinating, one of my favorite stories is that there was a Basque businessman who was kidnapped. He was an industrialist, and he was a nationalist, but he wasn't, his nationalism did not conform to he wasn't a supporter of the ETA, the Basque rebels. And he and his kidnappers were fairly relaxed, and they got to like each other, even though he was a lot older than they were. They were very young, as often. And then they get orders to kill him, and they take orders. And after it happened, and after some of them were arrested, they justified what they did. That they liked him, but the movement depended on this. But there are others, the IRA. In fact, the nationalists tend to be more successful than the PLO, the FLQ in Canada. Some of us are old enough to remember the execution of Pierre Laporte. With Israel, it's interesting that while Menachem Begin goes on to make peace with, though reluctantly, with Sadat, Yitzhak Shamir, who is his successor, spent most of his adult life as head of a group of Mossad. And Mossad was a counter-terrorist group, and I'll say a little bit about counter-terrorism. Mossad executed people. It assassinated people, not only in the occupied territories, but in Europe. The bloodiest event in Canadian history, though it didn't take place, the actual explosion didn't take place in Canada, was the Air India disaster. And it was done by Sikh nationalists. There are also a group I call the utopian revolutionaries. There is the emergence. They come out of, in some ways, the idealism of the 60s, I'm very sympathetic to it because I spent the late 60s in Berkeley, where there was a lot of very utopian thinking. Now, I don't think any of my students got involved in bombing people or holding up, but there were a number of groups, of which the best known was the Weatherman. And these groups often hive off similar groups because they're frustrated by bourgeois society. And they're frustrated by the slow process of change. There was a lot of hope, but also a lot of frustration. And people were frustrated by the political process. There were an awful lot of primary elections, in which we got 45% of the vote. There were, and then one of the things I learned in the 60s is that you could put 1 million people in the streets, and then when the election took place, you still lost the election. There was a sense when you were part of one of the great marches, like I was at the Aldermaston March, the anti-nuclear march in England once. I was on some of the San Francisco marches where they put 1 million people on the street. There was anger and there was eloquence, and yet when it was all over, the United States ended up with Richard Nixon, and Britain didn't abolish the bomb. And at the same time, these groups have radical they want a different kind of society. The first, and they want to rebel in many ways. The Baader-Meinhof gang tried to establish relations with the PLO, and they got kicked out by the PLO because of their sexual activities. Free love on the roof was not what the PLO thought revolution was all about, and these groups were interested in creating a society which many of us have thought about. You know, I know a couple Berkeley hands here. I mean, they wanted a society that was free and egalitarian and democratic, and they saw that for them, democracy didn't work. It didn't do it. And they wanted something more, and they became fascinated with the idea of violence. The Baader-Meinhof group, I think, lasted less than half of a decade. I mean, the German police are very efficient. The Red Brigades in Italy were more successful. And in fact, the Red Brigades were paired with a group called Autonomia, which had a capacity to put people in the street for supposedly they both wanted revolutionary goals, but the Red Brigades were willing to use violence and killing. And as with many of the other assassinations, the guy, the most publicized victim of the Red Brigades in Italy was Aldo Moro. Now, Aldo Moro was a Christian Democrat, and if you assume that all Christian Democrats are evil because they're compromised with Catholicism and with capitalism, but as Christian Democrats went, Aldo Moro wasn't one of the worst. He was the guy who opened up a strategic compromise with the Communist Party. But again, for the revolutionaries, the communists were not the enemy. We're not the friends. The communists were too bureaucratic. The communists were, these people were, wanted to go, as many Marxist intellectuals in the 60s and 70s were. The Japanese Red Army was even more utopian. The Japanese somehow have an ability, Japanese radical groups sometimes have an ability to link themselves to distant movements and areas that are far from their own experience. The most publicized event or operation of the Japanese Red Army was one in which they flew into what is now Ben Gurion Airport. It was then Lod, and after they had guns, which they couldn't get through security today, I hope. And when they got off the plane, they pulled out their guns and just started killing people. And the group that was most brutally decimated was a group of Puerto Rican tourists. Again, and unlike some of the assassinations and kidnappings are often very well organized. The blind terror, like where you set off a bomb in a marketplace, or where you do with this Lod thing, you get off a plane and you start shooting, and you're going to kill the people who are nearest to you, and they're not necessarily the people you want to kill. They were probably involved in a religious tourism. Now, among the utopians, there are also a handful of Lone Rangers, who I'm not really going to get into. The most interesting one in the United States was the Unabomber, who would mail pipe bombs and letter bombs to people, and also issue manifestos. Also, the right-wing terror. It's not a left-wing thing. I mean, the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhof gang, they're all left-wing. But Timothy McVeigh is right-wing. And Timothy McVeigh is rooted. I mean, when he got out of the army, he's a normal, and people who knew people who tried to study, and he's hard to study because they executed him. He was convicted and executed. But he was involved in militia and survivalist groups. Now, this network is quite large in the United States, and they do engage. They don't usually blow up public buildings and kill, I forget, 100 and some odd people. Though, again, when Timothy McVeigh, like the Japanese Red Army, there's a nursery school in the first or second floor of the McMurrich building, I think it's called. But you set off a bomb, and there was a big bomb, and they chose the building because it had a glass facade, so that the bomb, the blast from the bomb would not be blocked by walls. But he wanted to. He wanted to attack the U.S. government. He was hostile to the U.S. government. I mean, there's an ideology which talks about freedom, which sees the state as hostile. Just last year, there was an occupation by militia groups from Nevada and Oregon in an Oregon wildlife refuge. And the Americans were cool, which they probably wouldn't have been if it was a Muslim group. They waited out the group eventually gave up, and I'm not even sure what actions were taken. But since between 1902, and I don't remember what the terminal date is, between 1902 and the decade after, or so after 1902, there were 9 Islamist attacks in the US, killing about 45 people. There were 18 attacks killed by right-wing groups, killing 48. Now, some of them were assassinations, some of them were people beaten. I don't know the exact nature, but I do know there have been events, there have been radio journalists who've been assassinated. There's so much killing that goes on in the United States that many events take place, and if it's only 1 or 2 people being killed, you know, if you haven't killed the president or the vice president or Martin Luther King, there's really not much publicity, and the media sometimes wait to find out if it's a Muslim terrorist, because it's not a Muslim terrorist, it's not very interesting. Interesting, the most important terrorist group in American history, and the oldest, is the Klu Klux Klan. And the Klu Klux Klan's ideology was one of intimidating, of scaring black people by killing them, by burning their homes, by burning their churches. And they continued to use these tactics. And people like Brian Stevenson, a black lawyer in Alabama, would argue that, and lynching, you know, people who were lynched were not tried. Simple thing. You believe in in the rule of law, you try people. And the whole idea of lynching was to intimidate and create fear. And I may add, if you can permit me an aside, if you want to understand what this meant, you should read Richard Wright's biography, Black Boy. Richard Wright grew up in Mississippi, where it was dangerous to admit that you were intelligent, that you read books. And that was the world the Ku Klux Klan created, and it was terror, pure terror, though it's not often talked about in those terms. In Italy, the response to one of the responses to the Red Brigades was the formation of right-wing groups, which used assassination, which threw bombs and whatnot. And in fact, one of the things, counter-terror, terrorist tactics have been used as systematically by right-wing groups and by the state as they have by left-wing groups. I would say that probably one of the largest terrorist organizations, or maybe 2 of the largest terrorist organizations in the world, are the Pentagon and the CIA. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about, and it was worse in the 80s when you had a government under Ronald Reagan that was committed to the use of counterterror. I mean, it funded 3 wars in Central America. The Nicaragua, the Contras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And these were brutal regimes that massacred people, that bombed, that executed not only leaders of peasant groups or labor groups, but often sympathetic. I mean, one of the cases, the murder of Archbishop Romero, the murder of 6 Jesuits in Guatemala. I mean, a whole series of things where even Americans the fact that you had an American passport didn't mean that people educated at the so-called the school known as School for Americas is a school for members of Latin American militaries, and it's it was originally, I think in Panama, but it got moved to Fort Benning, and it's been at Fort Benning for, I don't know, half a century. And they teach people how to torture people, how to make bombs, how to arrange assassination. And many of the worst actors in these Central American wars, but also in places like Chile, were people who were trained at the School for the Americas. The CIA has funded this. There's a regular use of terror against Cuba, and it testifies to the ability of Cuban. And some of you have read about some of the ludicrous things, like putting a bomb in one of Castro's cigars, and they never succeeded in assassinating him. But the Cuban, you had a group of Cuban right-wing opponents of Castro who got funding and were quite active. The other active supporter of counter-terror is the South African government. I mean, I'm about ready to close it, to just make some final comments. I went to school with Eduardo Mondlane, and when I was, and Mondlane was, I was an undergraduate, and he was a graduate student. But I still remember a meeting where he was talking to a guy from the Friends about peaceful resistance, how you can use civil disobedience to achieve your objective. Once he became a leader of a guerrilla movement, obviously he rejected that. And the one time I saw him, when he came to Berkeley when I was there, and we had a meeting, we had dinner at my house while we waited for him to take him off to his airplane, to his next connection. And he explained that he was opposed to terror, and he's well known for his, by saying opposed to terror, it didn't mean he didn't want to kill people, but he wanted to kill soldiers. He wanted military objectives. And he didn't want to set off bombs in rural markets or in, and because probably the most chilling thing he said in the course of that conversation, he described how with one bazooka shot, you could wipe out a column of soldiers marching single file through the jungle. But this was war. And this was this was not terror. The group that used terror systematically was a South African funded group called Renamo. And South Africa was interested in destabilizing the countries, the independent African countries around it. And they were quite clever about it. Let me make a few general comments, and I'm not going to actually talk very much in order. First, the line between terror and revolution is often blurred. That many of the most successful, many of the organizations that use terror are revolutionary organizations. That is, they're not like the Baader-Meinhof gang, a network of intellectuals. They are groups that command armies, guerrilla armies. I'm talking about Algeria. I'm talking about the EOK in Cyprus. I'm talking about the PLO. I'm talking about Malaya, about Rhodesia, Angola. For these groups, terror is a complement, is a supplement to military action. I mean, the key to the eventual victory of the MPLA in Angola is when they repulse an invasion at a place called Quito Carnavale, do I have the name right? In southern Angola, an invasion funded by the South Africans. And it's a straight military thing. And any terrorist activity is supplementary. Furthermore, I will say those groups that have been effective are groups like the Basque Nationalists and the IRA that are able to command popular support. The problem the IRA had is the British couldn't defeat the IRA, and the British tried. They did everything, including some pretty brutal things. But the IRA was brutal too, and so were the Protestant groups. But Northern Ireland is 2/3 Protestant, and eventually they had to be some kind of a political settlement. And it's a political settlement. You can debate whether the IRA won but the IRA was able to change the nature of the government in Northern Ireland, not in a way that the more militant members would have wanted. I'm not going to say much about the Islamic movements, except that until the beginning of the opposition to Israel, which begins with raids across the border by people called the Fedayeen, none of the organizations I've gone through, I've seen no, in my readings, I've seen no Muslim terrorist groups before the 1970s. Fedayeen is 60s, 70s, before this period. And the development of Muslim terror. I'm also going to say one other radical thing. I think, though Hezbollah and Hamas use terror, as does Israel, I don't see any of them as basically terror. I think they're using terror. They're not only is terrorism a tactic, but they're using terrorism to complement other activities. In both cases, Hezbollah is most interesting because the Shiites, France ruled Lebanon through a balance between different religious communities. And the compromise between these communities was perpetuated, but the weakest partner to this compromise was the Shiites, who were quite numerous and certainly dominated the south of Lebanon. Furthermore, the Shiites bore the brunt of Israeli counter because they're in the southern part of the country. And Hezbollah was originally a reaction both to the domination of particularly the Maronite Christians, but also the Sunni. The Maronite Christians were linked to Israel, and also because of resistance to Israel. And Hezbollah rationalizes the use of terror, the use of actually suicide bombers, because of their relative weakness. But by organizing, they've been able to establish a strength that makes them today the dominant power. And they do things that many of us will dislike. They're linked religiously to the Assad regime, but they are not first and foremost terror. And the current leadership of Hezbollah is probably mostly committed to protecting the Shiites of southern Lebanon. And it's as simple as that. And if they have to use terror to do it, they use terror. Again, it's a tactic. And I could go on with Hamas. But the Islamic terror is another subject, really. Okay, I've only touched on a handful of movements. there are hundreds and maybe thousands over the last 140 years. I've not talked at all, for example, about the urban guerrillas of Latin America. I've not talked about the Romanticism. I knew a young German woman in the Congo, a very nice woman, but who was just fascinated and who died. I never knew how she got killed. But the Congo she was disappointed in the Congo because when I was there, Patrice Lumumba was gone. There was no revolution. There was just a CIA-supported dictatorship. And she went off to Latin America and died. And I know this from a mutual friend. And I don't know, but Renata was one of the Germans who idolized revolutionary violence, and I felt sad because I thought she was a nice person. In any case, repeating what I have to say, terror is not an ism, it's a tactic. Terrorists are more misguided than evil. I don't like terror. I don't like killing people. I don't like war. Terror is often dysfunctional. The terrorists themselves often die young. And they often have the opposite effect. The effect is often the opposite of what they want. Now, I will say that I don't know, though other people in the room may challenge this, whether the effect of these European romantic revolutionary groups in the 1970s and 80s was negative. In some cases, terrorists are freedom fighters. Certainly the involvement in the major anti-colonial movements. Terror is a tactic being used. And sometimes, as with the IRA, they achieve partial success. Where they are successful, it is where they are a part of larger movements. It is not the Irgun that wins independence for Israel. It's the Haganah, which is an underground group which is organized underground and becomes, in the course of the war, a regular army. And those groups that are successful are largely successful because of that. In other words, for those seeking power, the more important ideologies are the ideologies of guerrilla warfare, not the ideologies of terror, which often involve fantasies and utopian goals. Okay, I think I should probably